Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports. Welcome back to the Hello, Old Sports podcast here on the Sports History Network. It is wonderful to be with you all again for a little bit of a different type of episode. We usually take our name very literally here on Hello, Old Sports. We usually talk about old sports, and this time around, we're going to talk about sports that are not quite so old, and I'll explain the premise of that to you folks in just a minute here. I'm Dan Newman, of course, and I want to welcome, as always, my co-host, Andrew Newman. Andrew, how are you today?
I'm good. Dan, how are you?
Good. This is sort of, I'm curious to see where this one is going to go. I feel like we're kind of, I'm hoping this goes well. Our goal is to talk about the greatest sports moments of the 21st century. And what sort of prompts this is that I was looking through we often reference my book collection on the show, and I have these two coffee table books from about 20 years ago that were written by a man named Joe Garner, and they had two accompanying CDs that were narrated by Bob Costas, and it was sort of like the 50 or so, and there were two. One was called And the Crowd Goes Wild, and then there was a sequel called And the Fans Roared, and each was a collection of 45 to 50 sports moments from the 20th century, complete with, a little bit of narration and radio or television broadcast clips, kind of telling the story of some of the major moments, good and bad, in sports, over the course of whatever, 75 or so years since radio broadcast had started to be available sometime in the 30s. So I started thinking, what would we include if we were to update that? What if we were to do a third book covering only the 2000s, only from 2000 on, only the 21st century? And what would some of those moments be? So we've done a lot of lists on the show, obviously, in the past, and I don't know if we'll necessarily leave this with a hard and fast list, but I kind of want to just kind of have a conceptual, this is sort of a bar conversation. This is, two guys talking about what they would include if they were to put this type of a list together.
Yeah, and I actually found this a little challenging, to be honest, how to go about coming up with the list. Did I go annually? Do I sort of look at each sport? Do I pull up a list of events for each sport from each year? Because we're not talking 5 or 6 years here. We're talking 21 years. This would be the equivalent of saying, what were the best sporting events or the biggest sporting moments in the 70s and 80s? At this point, that's what we'd be talking about. So what I ultimately ended up coming up with is I just started writing ones down off my head, first of sort of ones that maybe weren't from the sports we would consider talking about. The Olympics are on, so I just came up with a couple of Olympic things. And then where I got most of my list from, and it's not using list as generous, I just kind of went through all the teams in basketball, baseball, and football in my head and just saw what came to mind. So I did mine basically off the top of my head. I'm sure it's not comprehensive. I'm sure I'm missing a lot of things. I have a good amount written down, at least, that I think we can, I don't think I phoned it in, really. It was just hard for me to conceptualize how to go about starting this.
And I think, generally speaking, we want to tell a story, or we want to tell the story of sports over the last 20 years. And so you want to spread it out. And I'm going to read, before we start in a minute, I'm going to read the list from the first of these Bob Costas books. And I know that might be a little bit tedious, but I want to just sort of give you an idea, give the audience an idea of what the moments were included on this type of list. I think the sort of maybe the most important thing is that you don't want to bunch it up too much. So, at least for me, you weren't going to do, 8 New England Patriots moments or, 6 LeBron moments, that type of thing, because you want to kind of, in your 4 dozen or so, you want to have room for enough. And I, like you, and I especially benefiting from the love of the Olympics that my wife Allison has in watching the Olympics the last week or two. She's been suggesting a number of them to me, and many of whom I accepted. A few of them I had to tell her were a little too obscure. I think the other thing is that we want to it sort of has to be something that, at least for me, that made its way into the national consciousness. So in talking about this, she said, well, I don't remember which one of us brought it up, but we've done an episode on BU hockey in the past, where BU hockey against Miami of Ohio in 2001, they were down 3-1 in the championship game with like 40 seconds left and had pulled their goalie, and they scored 2 goals to tie it up and then a goal in overtime to win the national championship. And this was something that was known. It was on ESPN. It wasn't like this was just something that happened, but nobody knew about it. Nobody talked about it the next day outside of maybe the Boston area. So it had to be, to me, something that, even if it was in a sport that maybe doesn't necessarily always get the attention, it had to be something that sort of pierced the public consciousness for me.
Yeah, and I think that's a good answer. And that was a sort of complicating factor I wanted to talk about with this, which is that you don't have historical you don't really have the benefit of which things have stood the test of time. Most people would consider one of, if not the most famous baseball moment of all time, to be the shot heard around the world, the 1951 3-game playoff between the Giants and Dodgers. It's a famous moment because it stood the test of time. You know what I mean?
True.
There have been other 1-game playoffs. There have been other, walk-off home runs in postseason series or things to tie. And certainly one of the reasons it stood the test of time is because of all these factors that went into that game. But we're able to quantify that now, given that it was 70 years later, people still know what it is. You don't have a lot of the benefit with that here. There are moments that probably won't be on this list for that very reason, that people would have said in 2008, 2009, whatever, like, oh, the people will be talking about this forever. And a couple of years later, it's not as well known. Tougher to not have all of this sort of will future generations care about this kind of thing,
Totally. All right, let me just read through the list from the first book by Garner and Costas called "And the Crowd Goes Wild," because I think it gives an idea of what we were thinking, sort of going to the framework from this. So there's about 50 of these, and I'll just read through them. Babe Ruth calls his shot. Jesse Owens wins 4 gold medals. Joe Louis knocks out Max Schmeling. Lou Gehrig says goodbye. Bobby Thompson hits the shot heard around the world. Don Larson throws World Series perfect game. The greatest game ever played, Colts versus Giants. Wilma Rudolph sprints to Olympic gold. That's the 1960 Olympics. Ted Williams finishes career with home run. Bill Mazeroski home run wins World Series. Wilt Chamberlain scores 100 points. Billy Mills wins 10,000-meter gold in the 64 Olympics. Havlicek's steal clinches Celtics victory. Green Bay Packers win the Ice Bowl. Bob Beamon soars to long jump record. Joe Namath and underdog Jets win Super Bowl III. Miracle Mets win World Series. Willis Reed leads Knicks to victory. Mark Spitz wins record 7 gold medals. U.S. Olympic men's basketball team upset by Soviets. That's 1972. The Immaculate Reception. Secretariat wins the Triple Crown. Billie Jean King wins the Battle of the Sexes. Henry Aaron breaks the home run record. Muhammad Ali, 3-time heavyweight champion.
That's not a moment. Oh, I guess are they saying the moment he won the 3rd championship?
No, it's sort of a look at his career.
That's a cop-out.
They cheated a little bit there, and there's going to be one where I think I want to cheat for ours. So that's informative, I think.
As long as the referee's back is turned.
Carlton Fisk waves World Series home run fair. Nadia Comaneci scores a perfect 10. Johnson versus Bird in the NCAA championship. U.S. Hockey defeats the Soviet Union, Miracle on Ice. Bjorn Borg defeats John McEnroe at Wimbledon. The Catch, 49ers versus Cowboys. Gordon Johncock wins the 1982 Indianapolis 500. The Play, Cal versus Stanford. That's the famous band on the field. NC State upsets Houston, 83 basketball. Richard Petty wins 200th career race. Boston College beats Miami on Hail Mary pass. It's Flutie. Jack Nicklaus wins Masters at age 46. Dodgers win on Kirk Gibson home run. Buster Douglas upsets Mike Tyson. Carl Lewis anchors U.S. Olympic victory, 92 Olympics in Barcelona. Wayne Gretzky captures NHL scoring mark. Rangers win the Stanley Cup in 94. Tiger Woods wins the Masters in 97. Michael Jordan wins the 6th NBA championship. France wins World Cup on home soil, 98. McGuire smashes the home run record, 98. And then the U.S. women win World Cup soccer. So that's 48 moments. And the reason I read that is because I think it's sort of the focus is on sort of the big three, baseball, basketball, football. But there's room for Olympics, NASCAR, hockey, soccer, tennis, golf, whatever. And there's also room, I feel like, without overdoing it, for a few moments that don't have any immediate American nexus. Whether that's France winning the World Cup in 98, whether that's Nadia Comaneci, who was, I believe, Romanian, scoring a perfect 10 in gymnastics. So at least from my way of thinking, I don't know if you agree, it's not even. We're not going to consider everything even, but there's room for some of this other stuff to float in there, here and there.
And we should be honest about the fact we're probably not going to do a good job with that. We're going to come to this from our perspective, which is Americans, primarily basketball, baseball, football fans, primarily pro. That doesn't mean that we're not going to
try.
We're obviously there's going to be college football things that need to be on here and college basketball things and Olympic things, but we will probably miss some stuff that somebody who came to it from a different perspective would get. So I feel like that's a necessary caveat. Just like, we're gonna do this with the acknowledgement of our sort of biases and perspectives, very much factoring in. It's the same reason we do an episode about the 1990s Baltimore Orioles with my friend Mike, and a lot of it is about the 1990s Yankees because that's how we relate to it.
All right, so why don't we go ahead and get started? And I think what we're going to do is we're going to start with the big three, and then we'll kind of take it from there. And what sport do you want to start with first?
Let me see where my lists are. And like I said, they started out all over the place, and then I tried to be a little more compact with them. I don't know. Do you want to start with football?
Let's start with football. And I also should note, maybe once we get a little further into this, I just have a note full of paper here. I have a lot of things that I wrote down, and as I'm looking at it, I don't know entirely what I'm referring to with some of these Olympics and stuff. So we may have to do a little bit of on the fly looking into these things. So, but anyway, you wanted to start with football.
Yeah, let's start with pro football, I guess. Just, that obviously I would think. And then maybe we do college football after pro and then go to baseball or whatever.
Works for me. Do you want to go through your football list? What did you have for football? I think I had 4 football moments.
See, I didn't do this with like any number in mind, so I'm gonna have to go through some pages, but I'll read some football ones I have listed here, and then get your reaction to whatever. I didn't come up with like, I can only have 20 of these. So,
nor did I. I happen to have 4 football.
All right, so. The first thing I have on my list, and these will not remain in order, but this one is in order, is actually from 6 days into the 21st century, and that was the Music City Miracle, Tennessee over Buffalo in the playoff. Frank Wycheck pass across the field on the kick return in the wild card playoffs. It was actually the 1999 wild card playoffs, but took place in January of 2000. I also listed the Saints-Vikings Minneapolis Miracle, the divisional playoff game where the Vikings had the very last chance with the Hail Mary that they then could have gotten out of bounds on. They did not get out of bounds on, ended up scoring the touchdown, and they won that. So I listed that there. I won't give a ton of context on these. I'll just kind of plow through them. 2006, the Saints returning to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina on the Monday night against the Falcons. There was a huge show, and they had a bunch of people there. I had the Patriots-Falcons Super Bowl overtime, 28-3. Falcons were up at one point. That was also the first Super Bowl that ever went into overtime. So I had that. Then I started getting into some different teams. So some of these will seem like a drop-off. I had the Odell Beckham catch on here is worth talking about. Just in terms of the highlight. Maybe my Giants bias shows a little bit there, especially in a game they did lose. But we're also in a highlight culture now. So that play became an instant cultural thing.
And you some of these, you have something like the Willie Mays catch on a previous. Now, obviously, it wasn't in a World Series, but it was on a Monday night game against the Cowboys. So I can get that. I believe it was Sunday night, but the Marshawn Lynch Sunday night. I'm sorry,
East Quake in overtime against the who would that have been against? I forget who it was even against. I think it was against the Saints. The play that registered on the Richter scale. Patriots Seahawks, the Super Bowl interception at the very end of the game. Obviously, the David Tyree catch in 2007. Giants winning. If you wanted to be a little bit broader, you could just say the Giants winning Super Bowl 42 over the 18-0 Patriots.
That's how I had it too. I had the Giants winning 42 over the Patriots. So yeah, either or, but that definitely makes it on the list.
And then just a couple more I'll talk about. The lights go out at the Super Bowl. Ravens 49ers.
Ravens Niners, yeah.
Yep. The lights go out at the New Orleans Superdome. I have the Tuck Rule game here. The Tuck Rule play, Raiders, Patriots in the 0-1 divisional playoffs. And then my final football one, I'm sure I missed a couple on my list here, but the final football one I want to touch on, and there's no doubting, you talked about, did this enter the cultural awareness? Thanksgiving night, I believe 2012.
The butt fumble?
The butt fumble.
Yeah, I can see that.
Now, again, if I had a list of 5, would that be on there? No, but those are some of my football ones.
You do have one glaring omission, I think, that I think has to be on there.
I'm positive I do, yeah.
But one in specific that I doubt you didn't think of it. Maybe you didn't, but I'm wondering if this is a little bit of...
Oh, the second miracle at the Meadowlands?
No, I think it's the Philly special.
Yeah, you're right. I guess that does.
Team hadn't won a championship in almost 60 years, and that crazy play, the Philly special play, to me, I feel like that has to be on the list.
It probably does, because you also have to remember, when you talk about moments of the 20th century in 20th century sports, you talk about, things that were also objectively bad. And this was objectively bad. So I will agree with that. So you're right. It should be on there.
Cool. Yeah, no, you definitely, you had more than I did. I think, and like I said, we don't necessarily have to come up with a definitive list. The ones of yours that I would definitely take, Music City Miracle, no question. The Minneapolis Miracle, absolutely. Actually, I should note that, not that I expected you or anybody listening to adhere to this with their list. I sort of, with these 2 books, I started when those books ended, and the second one of those was actually published in late 2000, so it had the Music City Miracle in it. So that was why that wasn't on my list. But yeah, if you're talking just 21st century, that definitely belongs on there.
And I just, in my head, I was also thinking if we did a chronological, if this was a chronological thing, you'd be we begin with our first moment just 6 days after the 21st century began.
I like that. I definitely have the 07 Super Bowl. I had the 28-3 game. I had the Philly special, like I mentioned. I sort of just trying to not select a ton of similar moments from the same time period. I went with the 28-3 comeback over the Seahawks game.
Sure.
If it had been different teams winning, I probably would have had both of those on my list, but I just kind of figured that.
Well, and one additional complication with football in this era was ones I listed more than you, ones I didn't even list. Okay, so we had the 07 Giants on there. The 08 Super Bowl is a great Super Bowl. The Cardinals against the Steelers.
Yeah, I thought about that too.
Yeah, the whole thing with the Saints the next year winning the Super Bowl, a couple of years after Katrina. There have been a lot of great Super Bowls in the last 20 years. So you can't, I didn't want to list 12 different Super Bowls on my list, so.
The other thing I thought about including, which was not a big, maybe not a championship moment, was when Brett Favre came back. Didn't come back, but when his father died and he had that amazing game. I think it was against Oakland.
It was.
I was that on a Monday night, I think.
Yeah, and the reason I know that is when I went to Lambeau a few years ago on the bus, tour bus we were on from Milwaukee. That was the game they played on our way up.
That's great. And then the only other, I kind of was torn. I was going back and forth about which was the bigger moment for the Pats in 01, whether it was beating the Rams in that Super Bowl with the Vinatieri kick in a game nobody thought they would win, or the Tuck Rule game. And I think, like you, I went with the Tuck Rule game kind of for the uniqueness of it.
Which one have you seen more highlights of in the last 20 years?
The Tuck Rule game. There's something about big football moments in the snow that are always going to make their way onto a highlight reel whenever anybody possibly can.
Yeah, the Leon Lett play, and yeah.
All right, so that's I think we got football pretty well covered. Pro football. Now, again, with college football, I had two college football moments that I had jotted down here, and I want to see what you have. So, do you want to give me your thoughts on college football?
2006 Rose Bowl, Texas against USC.
That was the first one I had too. That was Vince Young had an amazing game, right?
And that was the height of the dynasty, the USC, Reggie Bush, Matt Leinart, Pete Carroll teams, that were considered unbeatable, essentially. And I remember the beginning of that game, Texas was getting outclassed. And I was thinking, they just, whatever. And then Vince Young took them on their back. And then the next year, the game I have, and this was just a bowl game. This didn't have
what you're saying is that the 06 Rose Bowl was the national championship game.
Yeah, the 06 Rose Bowl was the national championship game. 07, This was just a game that was fun. This was the band is on the field kind of thing. And that was the Fiesta Bowl between Boise State and Oklahoma. This was New Year's Day of 07. And that was the game that ended with the Statue of Liberty play that Boise State scored. And it was the game where there were 10 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. It was if you turned it off, I always tell the story of I turned it off for a minute with Boise State up 7. I was playing PlayStation on my computer or on my TV in my parents' living room because I was in college. I was home on a break. I turned it back on and Boise State was up 7 again. And I was like, oh, I didn't miss anything. I had missed a touchdown from each team in 5 minutes. It took me a second to realize I was like, oh, no, they're up 7, but they both have scored since the last time I checked this. And the time it took me to have one PlayStation wrestling match, each team scored 2 touchdowns.
Wow. Yeah, I'm not going to say I'm super familiar with that game, but it definitely sounds like one that merits some consideration.
It ended with Boise State running the Statue of Liberty play where the guy fakes the throw and hands the ball behind, and the running back takes it from behind the quarterback's back.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll pull up the details on that, but what was your other moment?
Well, I was going to, first of all, just to go back to 06, also, I think it's worth noting that 06 USC-Texas game was also the last game ever broadcast by Keith Jackson, who was a legendary football and also did some baseball. He was actually the play-by-play guy when Chris Chambliss hit his home run in 1976. So he was, famous. The ABC.
Wasn't he the first Monday night guy for a year or two?
Yeah, he was. That's right. I think in 1970 he was the first Monday night guy. So a really well-known broadcaster, and that was since passed away. That was the last game he ever did. So it's worth including for that reason. The other game I had was the Iron Bowl, 2013, Auburn and Alabama, and something that was known as the Kick Six. I want to read here a little bit about it. The game was tied 28-28 with 32 seconds remaining. Alabama quickly moved to the Auburn 38-yard line, at which point the clock ran out, seemingly sending the game into overtime. And Nick Saban, the Alabama coach, challenges the timekeeping, and they put 1 second left on the clock. Alabama tries a field goal, which is short, and Chris Davis from Auburn picks it up at the goal line and runs about 109 yards all the way to the end zone to win the Iron Bowl. And this is, like you have throughout college football, especially in the South and Midwest. This is one of those late in the season rivalry games between two teams that have been rivals forever. Whenever a regular season game has a name like the Iron Bowl, you know it's really important to the fans and the school. So that was the other game that I had in there, the other moment I had for college football.
That Oklahoma Boise State game was Boise State actually had a 28-10 lead at one point. Oklahoma scored towards the end of the third quarter to make it 28-17. And then in the fourth quarter, Oklahoma kicked a field goal 3 seconds into the fourth to cut it to 8. Then they scored with 1:26 left. They scored to make it 28-28. Oklahoma scored again on a pick six a couple of plays later to go up 35-28. So they'd scored 25 straight points. So with 1:02 left, they had the lead. Then Boise State scored with 7 seconds left. It went to overtime. Oklahoma scored and kicked the extra point on their first possession in overtime. Boise State scored to make it 42-41. They went for 2. This was before they had to go for 2. That would have been like the third overtime. They ran the Statue of Liberty play and won 43-42.
Wow.
So just action.
Absolutely. Did you have anything else for college football?
Not that I could think of. If I was going to be a total homer, I would go to 2015 and talk about Army ending their 14-year losing streak to, I guess it would have been 26, 27, 18, 19. I guess it would have been 2016 when Army ended their 15-year losing streak, 14-year losing streak to Navy. I would put that on there, but that doesn't really justifiably rise to that level.
It's funny, Allison and I, when we were talking about this, she thought you would put that on. So
yeah, I wouldn't actually put it on, but it
bears mentioning.
Yes.
Do you want to do baseball next?
Sure, let's do baseball next.
All right, let me give you my list for baseball, because I had more for baseball. Baseball in a lot of ways lends itself better because you get, walk-off hits, walk-off home runs, that type of thing. So I had, try and go roughly in chronological order here. I had Barry Bonds breaking the single-season home run record in 2001. Mm-hmm. I had the Diamondbacks winning the 0-1 World Series on the walk-off hit by Luis Gonzalez off Rivera. I had the Aaron Boone game. I had the 0-4 Red Sox winning the World Series. I had the 2010 Giants breaking their drought and winning the World Series. That was the one I was probably the least confident in, so I feel like if one of them had to be knocked off for one reason or another, that was kind of my last one. I had 2011, I had the Cardinals in Game 6. Yeah, so the 2011 Game 6, I don't know what the deficit was that they came back from. I'm just kind of seeing the final score was 10-9. And so it looks like, okay, so they were down 3. The Cardinals were bottom of the 8th, down 3 runs. And David Freese had both the home run, and I think he also – did Freese have the game-winning hit in that game also, I think?
Yeah, they were down to their last strike twice in that game.
Yes. I'm looking here. David Freese and Lance Berkman became the 3rd and 4th players in World Series history to get game-tying hits with their team 1 out from elimination. So, yeah, they were 1 out from elimination in the bottom of the 9th, and then they were once again 1 out from elimination in the bottom of the 10th. So they came back twice. They were down 2 runs going into the bottom of the 10th and 2 runs going into the bottom of the 9th. So I think because it's the Cardinals and the Rangers and 2 teams that didn't really do a lot before or after, they both lost World Series, but it wasn't like they were dynasties, or it wasn't big moments or anything, or big stories like the Cubs a few years later. It wasn't like a big World Series drought for the Cardinals. But if you're talking about just like amazing on the field baseball, that's one of the best baseball games of the last 20 or 25 years.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And then I had the only other one I had was the 16 Cubs, which I think that goes without saying. That has to be on that. If you're only going to pick one moment, well, it might be the Red Sox, one of the 2. But so those were my baseball.
Yeah, I think the 16 Cubs and that whole Game 7 with the Indians, who had their own drought, and I think the Indians were up 3-1 in that series, and then
the rain delay,
right as like the Indians had like tied it up, or were about to tie it up, or whatever. Yeah, that definitely goes on there.
All right. I'm sorry, folks. We're having our share. Andrew was having some technical difficulties, and then I'm having some dog difficulties, so we'll try and cut as much of this out as possible, but you might get some residual unprofessionalism on this part of the episode. But, yeah, the 16 Cubs, big game, big win. Obviously, team hadn't won in, 108 years, so that has to be on there. '04 Red Sox has to be on there. So that's my moments. I feel like you got a good mix of big team and franchise moments, and then also just some really good, solid baseball moments.
Yeah, some other ones I could throw out there. As I'm looking at this, a lot of these are really bad, negative things. But I have the '03, the Steve Bartman game.
Yeah, that's almost got to be on there too. Maybe if you're doing a chapter, you just kind of include that as part of the 16 Cubs, but no question.
You could also talk about baseball returning to Washington, D.C. in 2005 as a moment after 40 plus years or around 40 years of not being there.
I hope you're not including that as one of your bad moments.
No. I have this, and I had almost forgotten about this, and I guess it doesn't really belong on the list, but it was certainly on that thing with the Royals and the White Sox where the fans, the father and son, ran out onto the field and started beating up the first base coach. That was certainly.
You probably don't need to include that, but yeah.
No, but it was
memorable.
It was memorable, yeah. And then another one that was, speaking of memorable, and find me a real precedent for this, the '07 Yankees-Indians Midges playoff game.
Yeah.
Where suddenly Java Chamberlain's face is covered in bugs and it's affecting the way, like, you've never seen that before. Like, that's unique.
Joe Torre always said that his biggest regret as a manager was not pulling his team off the field in that game.
Yeah, and he should have. So that was just a few more baseball moments. I mean, obviously the two droughts ending, and I mean, it probably, there's reasons for it, but we should, I mean, if we're going to mention two droughts ending, we should mention the White Sox drought ending as well. It's not on the same level. If you're a White Sox fan, you could ask why it's not on the same level as like the Red Sox one. It's just not. I don't know why, but it's just not. A whole lot of drama in the way they won it either. So
I think the two reasons really are, number one, the White Sox, unlike the Red Sox, just hadn't come close so many times. The Red Sox lost 4 7-game World Series in 46, 67, 75, and 86, all of which were super memorable World Series. So that's the reason, because the White Sox, they weren't even in a World Series. They were only in from 17 when they won. Then they lost in 19 on purpose. And then they were in it in 59, and then not again till 05. So, incidentally, the 59 White Sox is a topic of an upcoming listener-requested Hello Old Sports podcast.
Oh, and I have one more in a different section here that I should touch on. This wouldn't go on like the greatest list, but it certainly is the 2010 Armando Galarraga near-perfect game.
The one where the play at first and the umpire comes out and apologizes to him the next day for blowing the call.
Jim Joyce, yeah, for blowing the call, and and then he gets whatever. I don't know if there was 1 out or 2 outs in that inning, but he gets gets out of the rest of the inning, and it should have been a perfect game, yeah. And probably led to, not directly, but is one of the reasons we have replay these days.
I would also put in the steroid hearings, in probably the ones in 04 rather, in the Senate with Selig and Fear.
Mm-hmm.
Not the one that they had a year later where it was with all the players and Jose Canseco sat next to Mark McGwire and McGwire looked like he wanted to strangle him, and Sammy Sosa, after 20 years of giving interviews, suddenly didn't understand English anymore. But the one just the year before that in 2004, which were chaired by John McCain, that really kind of brought the whole issue into the forefront. So I would put those on the list too, again, if you're kind of telling the story.
Fair enough. I agree.
I'm assuming that you don't have anything sort of anywhere else in the baseball realm, that is to say college football or college baseball or anything like that.
So I didn't have anything on my list, but as you're talking, I realized one that, and this again goes to the hindsight thing, but probably should be on the list, and that is last May or June, I think it was, when the KBO becomes the first professional sport to come back post-COVID. Because it was on ESPN, it was on national, it was I don't want to say it was a big deal, but like games being played in the middle of the night, people, I remember picking a team, and I didn't really stick with it, to be honest. Once pro baseball came back, it also didn't help that the team once the major leagues in this country came back. It also didn't help that the team I picked started out like 1-10, and I was like, oh, this isn't very fun. But if for baseball as a sport, I feel like I would mention that the World Baseball Classic didn't rise to the relevance enough to be considered.
The only other thing that I think maybe you would bear mentioning, and this is going back now, this is like exactly 20 years ago now, and I think maybe because we were in New York, it maybe seemed like a bigger deal. Do you know where I'm going with this?
Subway Series.
No. I was actually
the Clemens Piazza stuff.
No, and actually, well, there's a moment that we do have to bring up as to why neither one of us are including it, because it was mentioned by our former guest co-host, your good friend Mike Petty, on our Facebook page. But that's actually not what I was going to bring up. I was actually going to bring up Danny Almonte. I mean, hey, that was a huge story in sports for a couple weeks. And for anybody who doesn't know what I'm talking about,
Was that post-2000?
That was 2001.
Oh, for some reason I thought that was the 90s.
No, it was the summer before I went to college. It was basically this little league team from the Bronx had this dominant pitcher, Danny Almonte, and they kind of took the heart of the nation for a couple of weeks, and then it later came out that Almonte was, I think, either 14 or 15, and so there was, that was a big controversy, and especially in sort of the dead days of July and August in sports when there's not a hell of a lot else going on. It was a pretty big controversy.
I guess we could also talk about, if you're going back that far, and like you mentioned, the New York focus. I've personally become a little tired of hearing about it. But all the post 9/11 baseball stuff, Bush throwing out the first pitch at the World Series, the Mike Piazza home run and the Mets' first game back, whatever that was, 10 days later or something like that.
Well, here's where I have to, two different things. I think that when we talk about the 2000 World Series and this is maybe my talk about, when I'm talking about kind of like viewing this as a potentially like, like a book type of thing where you're taking chapter by chapter. In talking about the Diamondbacks winning the 01 World Series, I think you also would talk about the, President Bush throwing out the first pitch, which was such a huge moment and sort of galvanizing for the country. And obviously, from a baseball point of view, you talk about those two amazing Yankee comebacks in Game 4 and Game 5. So to me, that is a really big deal, sort of all within the rubric of the 01 World Series. I find, and I want to be really careful how I say this, I find the Piazza home run to be very overrated as either a sports or a cultural moment.
I didn't really remember that until maybe the 2011. And I mean, some of it I'm sure is coming from being a Yankee fan and whatever, but I didn't really remember that until people started talking about it at the 10-year anniversary of 9/11 in 2011. The issue I get with a lot of this stuff, and again, I want to be careful, is when people start to talk about, and it started to heal the nation. No, there was still a lot of people dead. There was still a lot of, they were still down at ground zero, going through rubble and looking for bodies and things like that. Like, I think too often some of these moments, especially around 9/11, get reduced to like, and the nation began to heal feel-good stories. And it's like, no, they were just sports moments that happened around then that, yes, there's some ties when you're talking about New York or things like that, but I tend to reflexively pull back a little on some of that because I feel like there's almost an inherent agenda baked into some of that stuff. I can't help feel.
I would push back on that only slightly, and that I think that for New York, having the Yankees, who were the team in New York, having them sort of continually win in dramatic fashion in that postseason, whether it was the Jeter flip game, whether it was beating the 116 win Mariner team, which they were obviously the underdogs in that series, and then putting aside everything else, those 2 nights in a row where they beat the Diamondbacks on walk-offs, 2 nights in a row when they were barely hitting the ball, it was so dramatic for them to be winning like that I do think it made a certain segment of people in New York feel like they had something to feel good about for the first time in since 9/11. So I don't think it changed what happened or anybody's thoughts on what happened, but That's like one of the few areas where I look at it and say, okay, I get how this was meaningful for people in New York, myself included, during those couple of weeks. That said, I just can't go there with the Piazza home run. I mean, what did it mean?
Well, I think too, and again, there's always got to be like, well, we're Mets fans and we had one too. And it's like, no, you didn't. The Yankees, you can tell the story of baseball in 2001 without, that's a Yankees story. And it seems like that got added in as like, well, Piazza hit that home run right after not, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, no, it didn't. Yeah, I couldn't. I can never get there with whenever people talk about that as like one of the great New York sports moments of the last whatever number of years. I just can't get there with that because it didn't mean anything. Now, if the Mets had won the pennant that year or had won the division, which people forget they almost did, they had an amazing like 3-week run once they came back after 9/11 because the season had been kind of given up for dead. Then they came back and they went on this amazing run. I still remember watching a game on a Saturday afternoon where both Benitez and Franco blew the game for the Mets against the Braves. And I think if they had won that game, they would have gone to like a game and a half back with a week and a half to play. So long-winded way of saying, had they actually done something that season, maybe that would have been meaningful. But just one home run in a regular season game, I don't see that how that's galvanizing, even in the wake of 9/11. So Yankees in 01, yes. Piazza in 01 doesn't make it to that level for me.
Sure. So do we go to basketball next?
Yeah, we go to basketball. Why don't I give you my basketball? Because when we do hockey, I might count on you to carry the load a little more.
I don't have much of a hockey list.
I don't either. I only have 2 things, and one of them I think might be sort of betraying how much time I've spent in Boston over the last 20 years. But my basketball list is actually relatively small too. I have, well, let me put it this way. If you only had to pick one moment, what would it be? Because I'd have to imagine it's the same for both of us.
One moment, 20th century basketball?
21st, yeah.
21st century. And are you talking actual basketball? Like
yes.
On the court?
Yeah, well, I'm curious what your other would be, but go ahead.
Well, I mean, how much do you want to talk about Kobe Bryant dying or
to me that's not really a sports moment because if he was still an active player, if it was like a Thurman Munson type of thing, I would put that on there. But
totally fair.
Well, he died young, he died retired, so I know that sounds really callous, but yeah, I can't.
To me, if I had to pick one, probably the Cavs winning the championship.
Same here. Yeah, that was what I thought too. The other 2 that I had were the Ray Allen shot in that would have been the 13 NBA Finals when it was Heat versus Spurs, and that was the game. Yeah. It was in Miami, and all these Miami fans were leaving, and Allen hit this crazy 3-point shot to, I believe, did his shot send the game to overtime? I think that's what it was.
I think that's what happened. Yeah.
They won in
overtime, right? And then they won in Game 7.
I believe that's right. I'll look that up. And then the only other thing I had was the Pistons upsetting the Lakers in 04. That's kind of gotten lost to history because the Pistons never won again, and that Laker team imploded after that when Shaq left. But, you know, a team with 4 Hall of Famers in the lineup for the Lakers, Peyton, Malone, O'Neal, and Bryant, that was sort of the first super team effort to try and win a championship.
Yeah, you're missing a bunch.
Okay.
So, and I realize I have more than I should on here, but Kobe scores 81 points in a game in 2005.
Yeah, I guess I can see that.
Oh, no. If it was in the 70s, it would be something people would be talking. He scored 81 points in a game.
Yeah, no, I see your point. I guess to me it's like, and this is maybe where I was thinking more in the line of trying to keep my list to about 50, but yeah, it's definitely a big moment.
Then we go into 3 straight LeBron ones, one of which we already kind of covered. The title. I will throw the block that he made earlier in the series in as part of the title there.
Yeah.
I will include that. The decision when he left Cleveland.
I would put the decision on there too. Again, I might include that as sort of part of the LeBron Cleveland story, but absolutely.
Well, then you're probably going to consider my next one the same thing when he comes back to Cleveland.
Yeah, that's part of the same story to me.
Okay, I don't have him leaving Cleveland for the Lakers.
No.
I didn't get that granular. The Malice at the Palace absolutely has to be on the list. The Malice at the Palace is one of the most significant, memorable events. Not a positive one, but that goes on the list.
Mhm.
So there's that, and then a couple other basketball ones I have here. I've one listed here just as a point that it does not belong on this list, which is Iverson's step over in the finals against the Lakers in a game became an iconic image, but it was not really an important moment. They won game one of that series and then lost 4 straight games. People make it again as an image and sort of a cultural thing and a picture of who Allen Iverson was, but people go a little far with that. And then
it's only a big deal if you're a Philadelphia 76ers fan and the team really hasn't done anything in 40 years. Mm-hmm. But other than that, nationally, big picture, absolutely not. I agree.
And then the other 2 I have, one of these is a big story because of who was involved, and that's when Michael Jordan returned to basketball with the Wizards.
Yeah.
Again, would that be one of the 2 or 3 top moments? No, but it's Michael Jordan. It's, he went out on top with getting away with an offensive foul against Brian Russell. They win the title. He retires. The Bulls fall apart. And then 5 years later, he comes back to wear a teal uniform and play with the Wizards. And then the other one at the time was a big deal. Is even more of a big deal in hindsight. Do you have any guess what I'm talking about? Early in the time frame we're talking about.
Are you talking about, because I just thought of this, something that should be included is the 15-point comeback in the fourth quarter with Shaq and Kobe of the Lakers against Portland?
No.
That's
same era, one of those same teams involved. You'd probably guess it's not Portland. 2002 Western Conference Finals.
You know
Lakers Kings Game 6, a game that I have never. It's the only time in my life I have watched a game and considered that it was probably not on the level.
See, I was actually going to say something different. That's actually on my list. Something from that Lakers Kings series. I have the Robert Horry shot in what I think was Game 3, where
it got tipped back out.
Where Vlade Divac tries to kick it out to clear it, and it goes right to Robert Horry, and Horry hits a 3. And chances are the Kings win the series if they don't lose that game.
No, because the series was clearly fixed. So no, it wouldn't have mattered if the Kings had won Game 3.
If they let me see what game that was. If they had gone up, they might have gone up 3-1 if they had won that. I don't think the NBA would have. First of all, I don't know if it was fixed.
There was a referee Donahue was a referee in that game.
Was he though? I thought he just. Hold on, because now I'm curious about a couple different things.
Either way, that game was fixed. The referees were not going to allow the Kings to win that game. There was not a chance the referees were going to allow the Kings to win that game.
I wish I could completely disagree. I'd have to watch that game again. One of our other former guests, Ben Meyer Abbott from California, my college roommate, he's a big Laker fan, and he one time made me sit down and watch that game and pointed out all the ways that he felt it was officiated fairly. But I don't know. There's something there, and you're right. The fact that Donahue was involved certainly lends credence to the whole thing. So I just want to look here.
I guess the thing I say is I knew it at the time. This isn't hindsight. I didn't read this later. I remember watching that at the time and thinking that they are not letting the Kings win this game.
So the Horry game was Game 4. And I don't know that the league would have done anything to prevent 3 straight games from going to the Kings. Now, obviously, it's possible that the Lakers win a couple on their own. It's not as if the only way they were going to win. I mean, they were the Kobe Shaq Lakers. It's not like the only way they were going to win was with the league's help. But I don't know if 3-1 the league would have been able to do things to enough things.
Donahue was not a ref in that game.
Yeah, I didn't think so. But he made accusations later.
Yeah.
After Game 6, Mike Wilbon, who everybody knows, says, I wrote down in my notebook 6 calls that were stunningly incorrect, all against Sacramento, all in the fourth quarter when the Lakers made 5 baskets and 21 foul shots to hold on to their championship. Well, and then there's and I had forgotten about this, but there's a famous play where Kobe, and I actually just finished reading a really good book by Jeff Pearlman. It's called Three Ring Circus, which is about those Laker teams, the Shaq Kobe Laker teams. Great book, highly recommended.
Hopefully he'll have a sequel out in a few years about the Nets called the No Ring Circus. Go ahead.
He very well might. There was a play in the fourth quarter where Kobe elbowed Mike Bibby, and everybody said, okay, this is a foul against Kobe, or at worst a no call, and they called a foul on Mike Bibby.
For getting elbowed in the face.
Yeah. So I wish I could disagree, but I don't know that I can. So, but just real quick though, I want to go back to, because we were talking about the 13 finals. That was game 6. The Spurs were up 94-89 with 28 seconds left. LeBron misses a 3, ball gets tipped around, and James hits a 3 to pull it within 2 with 20 seconds left. Kawhi misses 1 of 2 free throws. Miami comes down. LeBron misses a 3. Bosh rebounds, passes it out to Ray Allen, who hits the shot to tie the game with 5 seconds left in regulation, and then send the game to overtime. So, and then the Heat go on to win it in overtime and then win the following night, the following game as well. So, yeah, I think that moment belongs on there. And obviously, all the Lakers and Kings stuff is very, very interesting. But I think that's all I had for the NBA. Do we want to talk college basketball for a few minutes here?
Yeah, let's do college basketball.
All right. So the first thing I have is a very selfish moment, but I think it has to be included on there.
Oh yeah.
Which is 18 in Charlotte, North Carolina, the 116 upset of the UMBC defeating University of Virginia in the first round. The first time a 16 had ever upset a 1 seed, and hasn't happened in the few years since. And I was lucky enough to be in attendance with my good friend Dan Tappan. It was the 4th game of the night. The way it works is you go to 2 games, and there's a little bit of break. They kick everybody out of the arena. You go get dinner or whatever, then you come back for 2 more games. And we had gone to the 3rd game, and then at the beginning of the 4th game, we turned to each other and said, we were driving back to his place, which was like, I think almost 2 hours away in North Carolina. And he was like, do you want to stick around for the 4th game, or do you want to head back? And we were like, why don't we stay until halftime and see how we feel? And then UMBC, the big thing.
Yeah, if it's 47-18 at halftime, you've seen enough.
You're beating the traffic. You've watched 3.5 basketball games that day. UMBC, sort of the hallmark of that game, and this was, Andrew's always said this, actually, about how in some of these early NCAA matchups, about how at a certain point you can tell the good team has just had enough. And it's just like, all right, we're going to put the pedal to the metal and win. And what happened in that game that doesn't usually happen in these games is that UMBC just kept hitting threes. They at a certain point, it's always like, okay, they're going to stop hitting threes. They're going to stop hitting threes. But that didn't happen. They just kept hitting shots and actually ended up winning. I think the final score, I think UMBC beat Virginia by like 20.
Yeah, because they just didn't stop. And I think UVA made a run, but the run didn't get close enough to scare UMBC. Because that's the thing you'll see in a lot of these games too, like 16-1s, 15-2s, whatever. Once they get to 6 or 7 or a little, it's like, okay, well now the other team's panicking. And they're right to panic, and then you can kind of take over. But there was never and also it goes to UVA's style, which was not, they didn't play like a typical 1 seed did.
They had a lot of like attrition. They basically they won low scoring games, which, like you said, is not the way top teams usually win.
So yeah, and I mean, again, credit to UVA because they came back and won the national championship the next year. So it's not like, it was a fundamental flaw in the way they were built. But it was the stuff that usually happens in 116 games where the 16 seed is flirting with an upset for a little while just did not happen in this game.
Okay, I had the 5 overtime game in, I think it was 2009 in the Big East tournament. That was 6 overtime game. That was Syracuse and UConn.
That's what I had on my list. Yep.
So yeah, Syracuse, UConn, 6 overtimes in 2009. in the Big East tournament at Madison Square Garden.
Yes, that was also happened to be, obviously didn't know it at the time, but in the sort of waning days of the old Big East too.
Yeah. Yeah, neither one of those teams is in the Big East. And well, UConn still is.
Well, they're back. They're not still is. They're back. They were in the AAC for a very long time because of football. And then I think as of actually this past year, they decided, this is killing us. So they went to the Big East for basketball. The AAC predictably threw them out for everything else. So now they're an independent for football. So, because there is no Big East basketball. So,
yeah.
So, there is no Big East football, excuse me.
6 overtimes, 2 legendary coaches, Jim Boeheim and Jim Calhoun. And I don't think neither team ended up doing anything of note in 2009, but just based on what it is and where it was, the Big East tournament is still a very big deal in college basketball. I think that definitely merits some inclusion on the list.
Yes, absolutely. Other college basketball ones, I think you have to put Butler's run in 2010 to the NCAA championship game in there. They actually did it the next year as well, but in 2010 they went all the way to the final. They played Duke. They lost at the end. I know I was still living in DC at the time, and we watched this game, and I will claim credit that I noticed this before the TV replay even noticed it, which is Duke had the lead. Butler inbounds it at the very end. The guy kind of throws up a 3/4 court shot that almost goes in. And then they're, right away they're going, oh, and Duke is the national champion. I was like, that shot almost went in. And then after like 10 seconds, they went to a replay and they were like, wow, he got this off in time and that shot almost went in. So that would have been the first, if had that shot gone in, that's the first thing we're talking about in this college basketball block on this list. And one other one I have to talk about, UConn women, when their winning streak ended, when they were beaten in the Final Four by Mississippi State. And I remember it was actually the next morning I was driving to Boston to go watch WrestleMania at your house. Yep. And I remember listening to the coverage on ESPN radio talking about Mississippi State. It was a 111-game winning streak for UConn, stretching back to 2014, and they lost in the Final Four of what would have been 2016, I guess. 2017. And, they didn't just beat teams. They were dream team level dominant, and them losing that game was a huge deal. So
I had a couple others, both sort of from the early part of the century.
Not the Southwest Philly floater?
Not the Southwest Philly floater. I think if we're going to have a LaSalle basketball, first of all, we've talked plenty of LaSalle basketball on this podcast, so I don't think we need to feel bad about not getting into too much detail. I feel like if we're not going to have BU hockey in 2009, we can't have a Sweet 16 LaSalle matchup in 2013.
Cousin Byrne will be upset, but we'll deal with it.
So the other two things I had, one of this is really early, but I think you have to talk about the firing of Bobby Knight in 2000. I did not put the Paterno scandal on there because that was just so much not really about football. But I think the Bobby Knight thing, I think.
Oh, yeah.
That belongs, I think. And then the other thing is, and I claim no expertise whatsoever in this particular field, but I feel like it might be a little bit unfair to the UConn women to only have a losing moment on there for them when they won so much.
No, you're absolutely correct.
The other thing I had was actually 2003 when the UConn men and women won national championships in back-to-back days, which as far as I know is the only time that's ever happened. So.
Oh yeah, that's that, and that you're right. You're absolutely right. Even as I was kind of reading that, I'm like, it's a little bit unfair to them. But I didn't even have it on my list. I just kind of came up with it in the spur of the moment. Oh yeah, we should really have the UConn women on there. But no, you're absolutely right.
All right. Have we covered basketball? Do you want to go hockey next?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. There wouldn't be any other basketball internationally or anything like that. The only other, if we wanted to mention something with the Olympics, I feel like we'll be talking about the Olympics in a little bit. So
I feel like 2004 when the Americans lost is probably the only real, Yeah,
I mean, the Redeem Team gold medal game against China at least gets a mention, but
especially because that would have been in China, right? Because that was 2008.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can
see that. All the guys went, and then they got challenged. Like they kind of run through the most of the tournament. And then the gold medal game, they were getting challenged a little bit, at least in the first half or so. And I just remember thinking, like, it's good. They're having to push a little bit. That's kind of cool that they have to push a little bit.
All right, why don't we do hockey, and then we can sort of have a conversation about where we want to focus on next. But why don't we try and bang out hockey here?
Okay. I think if you're talking about hockey, the main story from hockey in the last 20, 21 years is the 04-05 season being canceled. Mm-hmm. I feel like you do have to put that on there. I don't know, and again, I don't want to make it seem like I'm giving it short shrift. I just don't know that I have enough expertise on it. Blackhawks winning a championship and then winning 2 more after having not won for so long and being sort of an original 6 team that was I guess you maybe put the Blackhawks dynasty in some form on there.
The one thing that I had on there was something called the Phantom Goal, which was the Blackhawks in 2010, and it was a goal by Patrick Kane. And I just want to pull up the summary here. Philly, between the Flyers and the Blackhawks, Game 6, overtime, tied 3-3 at the end of the third period. Patrick Kane scored the cup-winning goal at 4:06 into the overtime period. A shot in which the puck crossed the goal line and then got stuck underneath the padding in the back of the net. And most people had originally lost sight of the puck. Only Kane and one of their teammates started to celebrate immediately. And the goal was not awarded until after a video review. So some people have called it the Phantom Goal. So I think overtime game, Patrick Kane, who's a pretty big star for the Blackhawks in the NHL, and the fact that they had an almost 50-year drought, that was the one kind of on-ice hockey moment. And I don't really feel like it's just the fact that you and I aren't hockey aficionados. Even in looking, it didn't seem to be a lot of huge NHL moments. I'm sure hardcore hockey people could come up with some stuff, but nothing else really jumped out at me.
I guess the other one I would add, 2008, the first Winter Classic.
Yeah.
Pittsburgh against Buffalo. Not just, just because of what that meant. That's now the NHL's signature. I will wager that if there are people who only watch one hockey game a year, it's the Winter Classic. Obviously, I'm not saying it's as big a deal as the Stanley Cup Finals and that kind of thing, but it's become, in a sport that, again, this is a couple years after the lockout, that really needed a signature event. I think the Winter Classic is worth putting on a list.
The only other thing that I had, and again, I think this is probably just because although I'm not a Boston sports fan, I've certainly spent a lot of time in Boston and around Boston sports fans, was 2001 when the Avalanche beat the Devils in 7 games, and Ray Bourque, who had been a Bruins superstar for God, I don't know how many years, and was traded mid-season to the Colorado Avalanche. He'd been playing since 1979. He played his whole career with the Bruins up until the season before, and he'd been traded to Colorado to get one last chance to try and win a Stanley Cup, and he finally did in 2001 and then immediately retired. Ray Bourque, I don't believe, is he a Hall of Famer, Ray Bourque? I don't believe so. He was named one of the 100 greatest NHL players. I don't know if he is in. No, he's in the Hall of Fame, immediate Hall of Fame. He was in the Hall of Fame in 2004. So, maybe a little bit weak, but a Hall of Famer who'd been in the league for 20 some odd years, finally getting to go to another team and win a championship. It's and they, as soon as they won, they skated over and handed the cup to him. It was very much kind of viewed first and foremost as a win for Ray Bourque. So with a relative paucity of hockey moments, I feel like that's one that could sneak in there.
Yeah, and I guess I honestly, when you started saying it was due to your history, I thought you were going to go a different place and talk about the Capitals winning with Ovechkin. Sort of having to view everything through the lens of the Penguins and Sidney Crosby, and the Penguins have won 3 under Crosby, and the Capitals continued to choke all those years, and he finally gets one. It's almost a Peyton Manning, Tom Brady scenario where you could argue about which one of them is better in the regular season or on the whole, but what you can't argue about is the team success. By the time Manning won his first one, Brady had won 3 already. It felt like a little bit of a situation like that Ovechkin finally got one after 3 cups for his sort of rival Crosby.
Yeah, and as droughts go, it's not a big one, but DC hadn't won a sports championship since 91, and this was, 18? So, 27 years since DC had won a sports championship, which, as cities go, is it's a decent amount of time. So
they didn't have to wait they didn't have to wait as long for the next one.
About a year and a half. It was great. All right, so I think we've kind of covered. You didn't have anything else for hockey?
No, and again, I will go back to my earlier comment that, like, we probably missed some, but just acknowledging that instead of just randomly pretending, going, oh, well, in 2012, this happened. Like, if we missed some and somebody wants to clue us in, please do so.
So we've done the big 4, and I kind of feel like now we got 2 big categories that we can go to. We can go to Olympics, or we can go to everything else.
Let's do everything else.
That was my thought, too.
Just because I feel like we're probably going to be kind of divergent here because it's such a broad category. So I'll just throw a couple. I'll throw one out at a time, okay?
Why don't we go back and forth?
All right. I'm going to start with one. I'll start with a couple I don't think you'll go with.
Okay.
I'm going to go with November 14th, 2015. Ronda Rousey loses to Holly Holm. Ronda Rousey was and still is to an extent, a very big cultural figure. The reason the UFC started doing women's competitions and now women's bouts are a big deal. There'd been women's MMA divisions before, but not at the UFC, not at the highest level. Ronda Rousey became this huge force, sort of like Mike Tyson, with a lot of first-round knockouts. She started main eventing pay-per-views, which, when you talk about UFC, the reason people buy them is for the main event. She was the biggest star in the UFC at the time, basically had never been challenged. Like, having to go to a second round was a big deal for Ronda Rousey, and she went out and got her butt kicked by Holly Holm that night, loses I believe it was bantamweight championship, basically ended her MMA career. She came back a year later, had one fight, got knocked out again, and retired. If we're talking about cultural, and I'm not an MMA fan, there's no arguing how popular it is. This was a huge moment that Ronda Rousey lost.
I did not have that. I actually did have a UFC moment on there, which I can get to in a second. But you've made your case. I think it definitely makes a lot of sense.
I would actually argue pretty passionately that belongs on any list.
All right. Well, why don't we stick with the theme here for a second? And again, I'm about to betray my incredible ignorance here. I had written down McGregor Diaz, and this is another UFC moment. This is a fight between Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz. And I'm sort of ashamed to admit that it looks like they fought twice, and I'm not even 100% sure which fight is the one I was referring to. I don't know if I take a minute, I might be able to figure it out. But do you have...
Yeah, I mean, the thing I'll say about McGregor is McGregor was... McGregor has been the biggest male star in the UFC for a very long time. Biggest overall star, certainly in the post-Rousey era, arguably even during the Rousey era. He is in a lot of ways a classic pro wrestling model person in terms of shooting his mouth off, realizing that the people who pay to see him get his butt kicked pay the same money as the people who pay to see him win. He's done some boxing matches and things like that, but there's no doubting that for a very long time, was a dominant UFC fighter as well.
All right, and I must be talking about the first fight because it looks like McGregor had never lost in UFC until his first fight with Nate Diaz, and Diaz forced McGregor to tap to submission with 4:12 into the second round. So an undefeated guy who's been dominating the sport, not only losing, but losing by submission, not by decision. That's to me, that has to be it. So yeah, if I was going to pick another UFC moment, that'd be the one I'd throw on there.
All right. Since we're in combat sports, boxing, there's a few ways you could go with boxing. I'm inclined to not pick more than one moment, to be honest.
Yeah, we talked about this on one of our first episodes. There ain't been much with boxing over the last.
Yeah, and so you have Tyson Lewis in 2002. and I'll circle back to that. Some other ones you'd be likely to point out in terms of event stature. You had De La Hoya against Mayweather. You had you had Mayweather against Pacquiao. You had some of these big fights, but it was also indicative of most of them came a few years after you would have actually wanted to see them. They were largely underwhelming fights from a fan standpoint, a lot of that having to do with the style Floyd Mayweather boxes, which is not putting aside any issues with Floyd Mayweather as the person. It's not his job to fight an exciting style. It's his job to win fights.
He's the UVA of heavyweight boxing.
Yes, the Wisconsin, more accurately. I would go with, if I had to pick one, I would probably go with Tyson and Lewis in 2002, just because, again, not a fight that totally lived up to the fight didn't live up to what people might have been hoping for, but the spectacle of it, the pre-fight press conference, the pre-fight press conference fight where Tyson bit Lennox Lewis in the leg and said some things that I know you want to play those clips and associate yourself with them. I'm going to say we probably shouldn't play those clips from Tyson.
I don't play clips.
What?
I don't play clips.
Okay. I was going to say the some of those Tyson quotes, your agreement with them aside, we probably shouldn't play.
I have to be honest with you, I don't remember what you're talking about. So somebody can look it up.
So I mean, again, and it was very, there's not when the bell rang, not a good fight. Lewis dominated him. Tyson was way past his prime. From a spectacle aspect, which, to be honest, at this point, if you're talking boxing, a lot of what you're talking about is the spectacle aspect of it. That would be my pick. But there are other, really, really good fight. If I had to pick a good fight, it would be Ward and Gotti from, I think, 2003 or 2002. But that did not penetrate the culture at all.
Exactly. I was just about to say that gets to the piercing of the consciousness type of thing.
Which it absolutely did not.
Yeah, I didn't have any boxing moments. I didn't think anything rose to that level.
Which is fair.
Here's one that I think you probably had too, and this is probably an easy one. 2015 American Pharaoh, Triple Crown.
Yeah, I had that as well.
Last Triple Crown had been in, 78, I think?
Yeah, there was Triple Crowns in 73, 77, and 78. And then not until 2015. There had been several horses that won the Derby and the Preakness. I remember growing up, there was a few in a row. There might have been like 4 in 6 years or something. I remember there was Real Quiet, and there was a few other ones where
there was the one in, I think, 99 that broke its leg and had to be euthanized after the Belmont.
And then there was Smarty Jones.
Did Barbaro win too?
I think Barbaro was the one who. No, maybe Barbaro was the one that broke its leg that they tried to recuperate. That wasn't the one that had to be euthanized on the track. But it was funny. I was in Saratoga yesterday as we're recording this, and that was the one place American Pharaoh lost a race, which fits in with Saratoga's graveyard of the undefeated's history going back to the early part of the 20th century.
It was Charismatic was the horse in 99.
Yep. But yeah, just, it had been so long, and I remember watching the Belmont when it happened and when American Pharaoh won, and just they kind of cut out to a wide shot of the crowd, and to just see the crowd, they weren't going nuts. They were more just in awe, just oh my God, we saw it. It happened. Whatever you think, a team wins the World Series every year. A team wins the Super Bowl every year. We can grade those based on dominance and say, yeah, the 85 Bears were much more dominant than whoever, the 87 Redskins who, won a strike shortened season, whatever. It's not given that a horse is going to win the Triple. And it was starting to become an issue of whether it was possible anymore, because the Belmont is 1.5 miles, which is much longer than these horses are used to running.
Yeah.
And they run those 3 races in 6 weeks. The Preakness is 2 weeks after the Kentucky Derby. The Belmont is 3 weeks after the Preakness. No other horse runs those 3 races. If you don't win the Derby, you don't run those other 2 races. So it's not like, in 78 or whatever it was, or where there was a horse that came in second all 3 years. That's not the way it is anymore. So you were wondering, maybe this is just never going to happen again. And then American Pharaoh did it, and it was wow, we saw it. No, I had never seen. I was 30 something at the time. I'd never seen it. So
And I should apologize. 2015, or I'm sorry, 1999 Charismatic did get hurt to not be able to win the Triple Crown, but was not euthanized. Actually, didn't die until about 3 years ago. So, my apologies to Charismatic for killing him about 18 years early. So, yeah, I mean, you can't get away from having the.
But there was a horse. You're right.
There have been a couple.
There was Silver Charm. There was Real Quiet, whatever. But there was a horse who was going for the Triple Crown at the Belmont, fell down, got hurt, and was euthanized. And I have to admit, I didn't know until a couple of years ago. Like, I was always like, well, why would they? Like, I know it can't race anymore, but from a PR standpoint, I didn't realize that when horse races, if they break their leg in a certain way, it's almost impossible for them to recover.
Yeah.
So it's not like a. And again, you can have your moral qualms with horse racing if you want. I'm not saying that, but like, it's not like, oh, we can't race anymore, we're going to kill it. In that specific situation, it is a thing they're making from a
Humane.
I was going to say humanitarian, but then I realized it doesn't technically apply. Yeah, from a humane standpoint.
All right, I think, where do you want to go next?
What other ones do I have here? So we talked about, I mean, I have golf. I have the Tiger Woods. I don't know if we want to consider the whole thing with him with the passing out and everything. I guess is that a sports story or no? I guess not.
I wouldn't think so. I think there's other Tiger stories you could put on there. I had two potential Tiger moments.
I'm guessing the one you had was him coming back and winning his first, was it the Masters last year when he finally won his first major after all that?
In 19, yeah.
Yeah. And then I also have 09, the U.S. Open. Maybe it was 08. I think it was 08.
Was that him and Rocco Mediate?
Yeah, the 18-hole playoff.
That was 08, and I had that on there too.
And the reason I should have known it was 08 is that was about 3 weeks after I'd started my first job out of college in D.C. And the break room, the company I worked for had a break room. And people would hang out in there, but you didn't like hang out in there all day. And they had a TV. Usually it had either the news or just like ESPN on kind of on a daily basis. And that day it was filled. There was people in there all day just watching the golf. And this was before even the upper level people at my company making high 6, low 7 figures a year didn't really have cell phones that you could live stream on in 2008. So there was like high level people in my company who just like camped out in there all day and just worked from that, worked in front of the TV all day to watch that.
The U.S. Open is the one major that doesn't do playoff holes. They do a whole another 18 holes the next day, the 5th day in a row of 18 holes, which it's easy to laugh and say, oh, it's golf, but that's pretty tiring I'd imagine. I don't play golf, but I mean, you've just gone through 72 holes in 4 days. That to have to go out there and do another 18 the next day, that's pretty. Yeah, you got to have some endurance there
because they train for 4.
Yeah,
they
exactly.
Train for 72 holes. So yes, absolutely. Those are my 2 Tiger moments. And then I guess it would have had to have been this century when Phil finally won his first major.
That was the 04 Masters when Phil finally won a major.
That goes on there too.
Yeah, well, no, but the question with Phil is do you really. So I would argue there's 2 Phil moments because what tournament was it that he won just a couple months ago? Was that the U.S. Open or was that that was another U.S. Open, wasn't it, that he just won?
Was that to complete his career Grand Slam or?
No, there's one he still hasn't won.
I guess he hasn't won the PGA. I don't know.
I'm pulling it up now. He's never won the British. Or no, he's never won the U.S. Open. Take that back. It was the PGA that he won this year.
Yep.
So he's won 1 British, 3 Masters, and 2 PGA. And he won the PGA in 20...
No, he must have won the British because it says he won the Open Championship in 2013.
Yeah. No, he hasn't won the U.S. Open.
Oh, okay.
I misspoke originally. He's finished second in the U.S. Open 6 times. He's won 1 British, 2 PGA, and 3 Masters. And I believe his win his win in February in May rather, when he won the PGA, that's the oldest person ever to win a major. So, and everybody talks about I think it was whatever year it was that Nicklaus won the Masters. It was actually in the book that I read the Crowd Goes Wild book. I think it was 86 that he won the Masters at 46. And so Phil broke that record. So that's a pretty big feat to be the oldest guy ever to win a major championship. So I feel like you got to have one of those film moments on there, and an argument can probably be made for both. If I had to pick one, I'd probably actually pick the recent moment because
the recent moment's more significant.
That's a record.
To golf. The first moment was more significant just to him.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're probably right.
I think I just did the Phil, so why don't you go ahead? I think we did golf. Where do you want to go next here? Do you have anything else non-Olympic? I have a few.
Yeah, you have to put 2000. I'm going to go to NASCAR.
Mhm.
I don't love that I have all these negative ones. 2001, Dale Earnhardt.
No question.
Oh yeah. Dale Earnhardt dying at the Daytona 500. Just really I don't want to say unfathomable because I feel like all these guys know it's a possibility every time they get into their car. But the biggest star in the sport, sort of the biggest active legend in the sport, not only dies, but dies during a race, during their most famous race, leaves a son who is going to carry his name within the sport for decades. Yeah.
And it also led to a lot of changes in the sport and the safety culture around it that may not have happened because it's not like he was the first guy ever to die in a race, but the fact that it was Dale Earnhardt who died in their biggest showcase, the race. That's probably the one NASCAR race that a non-NASCAR fan might flip on for a few minutes. So to have the biggest guy die in the biggest race.
And I think that might have been their first race on Fox. I used to have a VHS copy, actually, you taped it originally, of the 2000 NFC Championship game between the Giants and the Vikings, which was January of 2001. And it's either at halftime or after the game, they interview Michael Waltrip. And they're talking about how the week after the Super Bowl, Daytona 500, the first NASCAR race on Fox. So I believe that was the first NASCAR race on Fox that happened. So
there were unwatchable tragedies on TV 2 weeks in a row on Fox.
The Super Bowl 35 is on CBS.
Oh, that's a good point. Shows how much it's stayed in my memory.
But so I think it might have somebody more knowledgeable about this would have to speak to it, but it also seemingly changed the culture around safety improvements from like, why don't you just get out there and let them boys race to like, yes, if it sacrifices a few miles an hour, let's get it so that not that these guys won't crash, but when they get into crashes, they walk away from them.
I think that's right. All right. You ready for me to do another one?
Yes.
2008 Wimbledon Championship, men's, Federer, Nadal. Federer is ranked number 1. Nadal is ranked number 2, widely considered one of the greatest tennis matches ever played. Nadal defeats Federer in 5 sets, 6-4, 6-4, 6-7, 6-7, 9-7. So again, 4 hours and 48 minutes, which is long for a tennis match. Don't claim to be in any way any sort of a tennis expert, but I think the fact that experts consider it to be perhaps the greatest tennis match ever or one of the greatest got to be on the list.
Absolutely. Yeah, and again, those two sort of growing up, not knowing anything about tennis, to me, it was like I always knew it was like, oh, there was Sampras and Agassi, and then Sampras was around much longer, but those two sort of took the mantle after that, at least in the popular culture, as the two best tennis players, male tennis players in the world after that.
I think I have 3 more.
Why don't you just give them to us, and I don't believe I have anything more written down here, so.
So first of all, I feel like you need something with Lance Armstrong. I have one more written down, but you need something with Lance Armstrong.
True.
Whether that's his scandal or some of his amazing wins or probably a combination thereof, I think you need something with him. This is the one kind of international moment that I have, and I don't know that this would have even actually reached the level of inclusion in our theoretic, book or whatever we're putting together. And that is in the English Football League, and I don't even know that I'm going to be able to pronounce this. Leicester, Leicester. I'm sorry?
Leicester. You're talking about soccer now, or what are you talking about?
Yeah, soccer.
Leicester.
who were
I have this on my list too.
they won the Premier League and they had previously been 5,000 to 1 underdogs. You know,
I think
the
it's
odds
Leicester. I think it's actually Leicester.
the odds against them were 5,000 to 1 to win their division the following, before the season started, and they ended up winning the Premier League. So,
well, and the thing you have to realize about the Premier League is the Premier League started in the early 90s, started in 92, 93. The Premier League, there was what they called the Big Four era, and that's been almost entirely the whole time of the Premier League, except the team got added. Manchester United, Arsenal, Liverpool, and Chelsea. And then in the last 10 years or so, Manchester City has been added to that.
mm-hmm.
Those are the teams that win. There's not, the way the Premier League is designed, with the bottom 3 teams get relegated, and then the top 3 teams from the next level come up every year. Top 5, I believe if you finish in the top 5, you get into what they call the UEFA Champions League, where you play the top teams from the other, the Spanish League and the Italian League and German League. It's an era. 5 teams are basically, it's like college football almost. It's like, okay, you think Alabama's going to win, but you realize that, just in a given year, okay, Clemson might be able to win the championship. LSU might be able to win the championship. Ohio State. And then you go, okay, who's got an outside shot? And you're like, well, with their schedule, if Oregon goes undefeated, they'd get into a Big 5 bowl. They'd get into the playoffs. There is no contingency whereby Akron can win the national championship.
Yeah.
There is. If they go undefeated, their schedule wasn't good enough. They finish ranked 17th. They get into a good bowl. They make good money. At the start of the season in college football, there is no chance that most of the teams can win the national championship. And that's obviously from a game standpoint, it's not the same, because if you win all your games, you're the champion. But the way the leagues are structured, there is no chance for a Leicester City to win the championship. And they did. In the 2015-2016 season, the years before that, it had been, I'll go just a few years before that, Manchester United in 07, Manchester United in 08, Manchester United in 09, Chelsea in 10, Manchester United in 11, Manchester City in 12, Manchester United in 13, Manchester City in 14, Chelsea in 15, Leicester City, then right back to Chelsea, Manchester City, Liverpool, Manchester City. It's the equivalent of, like I said, Akron out of nowhere winning a national championship in college football. It's not done.
So I think that belongs.
Yes.
And then the other thing I had was, and I'm getting way out of my depth here, I feel like, especially given the political story that went with it, and maybe to a certain extent continues to go with it, I feel like the World Cup for the women in 19, the U.S. team, I feel like that belongs on there. They had a lot of fans, they had a lot of haters, but they got a lot of attention, and they won, and they were considered to be dominant. I think they even had the controversy where people accused them of running up the score. I think was that or, them?
Yeah, maybe not being gracious enough about running up the score or something like that. And I think if you want to even use them as an avatar, like a big story the last 10 years or so in sports has been athletes being more outspoken about political and social causes they care about. The famous sort of quote for years, and that we could do a whole episode on the accuracy of this, but was the quote attributed to Michael Jordan that Republicans buy sneakers too, as sort of his justification for why he didn't weigh into issues like that. And about 10 years ago, and this could be, I'd have to get the details right, but I don't know when it was, but 5, 6, 7 years ago, when LeBron and Carmelo and whoever got up at the ESPYs and basically said, like, we're not going to shut up anymore. We're going to talk about what we want to talk about.
I remember that.
This women's soccer team was sort of, their most famous player was Megan Rapinoe, very outspoken about her political beliefs, high profile in a long-term relationship with WNBA player Sue Bird. They were sort, in addition to their accomplishment, it's a good touch point on the whole intersection of politics and athletics and world issues and things like that. So.
Yeah, and I'm looking here that there was their first game in 19. They beat Thailand 13-0, which was the source of the controversy. So yeah,
And
I feel like maybe one without the other, I wouldn't go to Women's World Cup. But when you combine the fact that they won with all of the political stuff, I think that they're an important part of the story of the last 2 decades.
And that's another, as I'm realizing, one we probably should have added to our list at the beginning was Colin Kaepernick and taking a knee. I don't know if that's a specific moment, but it's.
Yeah, I think without had he won more or had like a major, I feel like the fact that Kaepernick has no on-field moment, really, I mean, he took a team to the Super Bowl, but, David Woodley took a team to the Super Bowl. I don't know that I necessarily would put Kaepernick on that level because that was entirely off the field. There was no on-the-field element to it.
Fair.
Whereas with the women's soccer team, if they were a bunch of diehard conservatives, they'd still be damn good on the field. So I kind of draw that distinction.
True. That's fair enough.
All right. So do you have anything else non-Olympic, or do we want to move on to the Olympics here?
No, I think we can get into the Olympics at this point.
All right. So I only had one Winter Olympic. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I had 2 Winter Olympic moments, both from the same year, both from the 2002 Winter Olympics, which were the Salt Lake City Games. I had the figure skating, the Olympic figure skating.
The French judge.
Where the French judge, and who was it that they screwed over? Was it Canada that they screwed over?
I think so, yeah. It was in the pairs. It was in the mixed doubles.
I watched the clip in preparation for this, and
how did you score it?
Hey, maybe I couldn't have done any worse than the judge did, right? So yeah, I just want to kind of I want to get this. It was mixed doubles, which for those who don't know it's called pairs, but it's men's and women, and the scores of the French judge's scores were thrown out, and the original gold went to the Russians. But even as you're watching this and you hear the commentators, they're saying that they think that the Canadians should have been scored much higher than they were. And it culminated in the French judges' scores being thrown out and the Canadian team being awarded a gold medal. The Russians also got a gold medal. So this is not the only analog I can really think of is the 72 Munich Olympics with the U.S. Soviet Union basketball. Now, basketball is a different type of sport, obviously, but there was all sorts of allegations of, that this judge was bribed, and there was an arrest of a criminal by the name of Almazan Tokathonov in Italy. He was later released by Italy, and it kind of really fell along, I guess, somewhat along political lines, in that Russia, China, Poland, Ukraine, and France, all of those judges had the Russians first. So with the exception of France, sort of kind of, communist and or Eastern Bloc countries, and then the U.S., Canada, Germany, and Japan had given it to the Canadian team. And there was, again, pairs figure skating is way outside my area of expertise, but a scandal of this level in the Olympics, I feel like, has to be included. Yeah,
and I'm looking here. It says when the French judge returned to the officials' hotel, Sally Stapleford, chair of the ISU's technical committee, confronted her. The French judge, and I'm just purposely avoiding pronouncing her name, had an emotional breakdown in which she allegedly said that she had been pressured by the head of the French skating organization to vote for the Russian pair regardless of how the others performed. She reportedly repeated this at the post-event judges meeting the next day, part of an advantage to get French people in the ice dance competition that was to be decided a few days later. Then she denied that and also stated that she truly believed the Russian pair deserved to win. And when you go to cultural, there was all sorts of as you're talking about this, I'm reminded of jokes Letterman would tell around the time, and then when it wouldn't get a reaction, he'd be like, "That got a good reaction from the French judge."
That's right.
The French judge became a big cultural thing.
And I also think the fact that whenever one of these, let's be honest, very fringe sports makes it into the national sports consciousness for even a couple of days, that kind of merits its inclusion. If this was a controversy over a bad call in an Olympic basketball game or boxing or whatever, it probably wouldn't be the same thing. But to have this tiny little sport that no one ever pays any attention to it, I mean, even within figure skating, the men's and the women's individual get a lot more attention than the pairs do. So to have this blow up in this sport is, I think, a pretty big deal.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. And I believe also after that, the price of pairs plummeted because people didn't believe in pairs.
Oh, my God. And
by the way, have you heard about the new corduroy pillow?
I'm going to cut this out, but no.
It's making headlines.
I don't even. Oh God! I didn't get it for a minute.
I could tell because you weren't laughing.
Yeah, that's what it was. And then I also had, and looking, I don't know if I'm actually as high on this as I thought I would be, but the O2 men's hockey final, Canada versus U.S., were the highest rated hockey game in Olympic history. I don't know that the U.S. and Canada had ever played each other before, or if they ever had since in the O2 finals. And I'm sure the fact that it was in the United States, it was in Utah, it was just so highly rated. Now, it didn't end up being a super close game, 5-2. Canada beat the U.S. So I'm not as high on this as maybe I put it, as I thought I would be when I put it down on my list. But that was the only other Winter Olympic moment that I had.
Yeah, I can't say I have a lot of. I know when, I think, was it 2006, there was some controversy in the speed skating or something like that with Bodie Miller, where he got disqualified. Not Bodie Miller, Apollo Ono, or somebody in the 2006 Olympics. I think there was some controversy with speed skating, where a guy got either disqualified or something like that. But yes, I can't say I had a lot there.
Before we get to the Winter Olympics, I'm just looking at my list, and this is another one of those where it's sort of it's not an Academy, it's not a Best Actor award. It's one of those sort of cumulative career awards that they give, because I can't point to a specific moment, but I feel like you'd have to have something in there about the Williams sisters.
Yeah, I agree with that too. That's
whether it was a year that they played each other in the finals of a major, or maybe, a double, because they think they definitely won doubles majors, I believe.
The other answer could be Serena. I believe Serena Williams won a major a couple of years ago, and it came out that she won that major while pregnant. Nobody knew it at the time because she was early in her pregnancy, but it turned out, like a couple of months later, she announced that she was, 6 months pregnant or whatever. And people did the math and were like, oh, she won the US Open or the whatever Open while she was pregnant.
I think I'd want to have something in there that encompassed both of them in one way or another. But yeah, this is sort of like the one you said was a cop-out for Muhammad Ali. And I said I had one particularly in mind that might kind of fit into that rubric. That's what I would do, I think, with the Williams sisters, is you just would have to do some sort of a retrospective, because there's no single moment, but there's a lot of really great accomplishments there.
Absolutely. Thumper agrees.
Thumper is a jerk. Thumper
is the Bill Roden of this show. He heard us talking about the Williams sisters, and he was about to talk.
Anyway, all right, so why don't we close with the Summer Olympics?
Sure.
And I got to say, I do kind of feel like there's a decent amount here. And the first place I want to go is to the 2000 Summer Olympics in Sydney. And this is another one of those sports that doesn't really make it onto the national consciousness all that often. Do you know where I'm going with this?
2000 Summer Olympics? I honestly do not.
This is Rulon Gardner.
Oh, yes.
In the Greco-Roman wrestling event, he defeated Alexander Karelin at the 2000 Summer Olympics. Karelin had been undefeated for 13 years and had not given up a point in 6 years. Gardner defeated him and in the process won the gold medal. He later won the bronze in Greco-Roman wrestling in 2004. I actually watched this live, and I then and now am not much of an Olympics watcher. I'll watch a lot of swimming because Allison loves it so much, my wife. But other than that, I watched very little Olympics, and I just happened to be home that night flipping channels and, landed on the Olympics. And going into it, they were doing a story about this guy who had been undefeated, this Russian who had been undefeated for 13 years, and how Gardner was hoping to upset him. And I don't think these matches take more than a few minutes, if I'm remembering correctly.
No, and you have to Greco-Roman, like when you think of, if you're like a person who's not versed in amateur wrestling, what you're thinking of is freestyle wrestling, what you see in high school and things like that. And there's freestyle wrestling in the Olympics as well. Greco-Roman wrestling is much different, where essentially like breaking your grip between your hands is a big deal. So it's a very different, and that's what we're talking about here. So
it forbids holds below the waist.
Yes.
So it's more of an emphasis on throwing than on sort of tripping and trying to get them just to fall down to the ground. You actually need to try and throw them down to the ground. And basically in amateur wrestling, you get a point whenever you do something to the other guy, throw them down or whatever. And again, way outside my depth here, but it had been what did I just say? 5 years since this Russian, since Carolyn had given up a point, 6 years since he'd given up a point. So this was a really big moment, and Gardner was a minor celebrity for a little while in American sports.
Yeah, it was definitely a big deal. 4 years earlier, there'd been a freestyle wrestling where Kurt Angle, who later became a famous professional wrestler, won in freestyle. So different, but he'd beaten an Iranian wrestler who hadn't lost in a very long time. But, the real deal here was more about how dominant. This is most Olympics, the Americans win or are in, especially since the breakup of the Soviet Union. The U.S. is either first or second in Olympic medal counts, especially in the Summer Olympics. But there are sports where you're like, the U.S. is not a factor. You'll watch an Olympic sport and you'll be like, oh, I don't know if this is one, but let's say badminton. It's like, oh, the U.S. is just not a factor in badminton. Greco-Roman wrestling was not a sport the U.S. was a factor in. It was a lot of, Eastern
Greco-Roman people.
Yeah, and Eastern European and things like that. And for him to win, and I believe there was a very famous picture of the referee raising Gardner's hand, and then the guy he defeated looking very disgusted with himself. That became, I think, might have been, it was either the cover or maybe like the middle of Sports Illustrated.
And it's not as if Gardner went on to then dominate the sport for years and years. He won bronze at the following year. It wasn't like he went on to win another gold 4 years later. So
exactly,
kind of a moment in time. All right, I have, I think, 1, 2, 3. I have four more Summer Olympic events, but I'll let you. Why don't you kick us off? What did you have?
Well, I mean, I'm sure you have to have Michael Phelps in 2008.
Yes.
The insane run. You may have the details. What was it? 8 gold medals that he won in 2008? 7 or 8?
I think he hadn't Spitz won 8 in the 70s, and Michael Phelps broke that record. Let me take a look here. I can pull
and generally the Summer Olympics, and we're obviously going through that right now, from a TV coverage standpoint, at least in this country, the first week is swimming, and then the second week is track, in terms of what gets the most attention. And that first week, it was, again, I had just moved to DC a couple of weeks earlier, and I remember the Saturday night, like one of the last nights of the swimming, I had just gone into the city to kind of wander around, and I went into a bar, and everybody was watching the swimming. It was, because it was Michael Phelps going for whether it was his 8th or his 9th gold medal or whatever. But that was just it was the biggest sports story in this country and the world for a little while.
8 gold medals. He set a world record in 7 of those events. And in the 8th, where he did not set a world record, he set an Olympic record. So, yeah, crazy.
And he became a celebrity. I mean, there was, people recognized his face, which for an Olympian is rare. It happens, but it's not doesn't happen to too many people, and he became an international celebrity, and he still is to this day. I think he's doing analysis on NBC of the swimming events in the Olympics right now.
He is. He definitely is. I think if you're going to do a men's swimming, you should probably do a women's swimming, and I would go with Katie Ledecky from 2016. Not quite.
Islanders.
I'm sorry?
Her uncle is one of the two principal owners of the Islanders.
I knew that and had forgotten it.
We'll remember it.
Not the same level of dominance as Phelps in 2008, but she wins 4 gold medals, sets 2 world records, and she's competing again this year in what's been called the 2020 Olympics. She's already won 2 gold medals and 2 silvers in this year's Olympics. I think it might essentially be over by the time you all
done for her. I saw her tweet something out because since I follow the Islanders on Twitter, they retweet everything that she tweets, and she said it was a great time, Tokyo, 2 golds, 2 silvers. I'm coming home, so I think she's done now.
So 4 gold medals for her in 2016 and 2 world records. This is obviously recently enough.
She also swam, I believe, in 2012 as a very, very young.
She was 15, I think, in 2012, and she won a gold in the 800 meter freestyle and set an AR, which I assume means an American record. So,
by the way, the other night during the Olympic coverage on NBC, they tweeted out women's 800 meter freestyle top times ever.
Does she have all of them?
The top 23 are all Katie Ledecky. She has swum the 800 meter freestyle for women. She has the 1 through 23 as the fastest times ever.
Jeez, that's crazy.
I mean, it's hard to think about. It's obviously it's a very specific length, but if you looked at the single season home run record and the same guy at the top 23, you'd be like, wow.
Yeah. All right. We got 2 more. Did you want to, or I have 2 more. You could have as many.
Yeah, go ahead.
So somebody who's been in the news a lot recently, Simone Biles, U.S. gymnast, 4 golds, also in 2016 at Rio in the team all-around vault and floor exercise. Don't ask me to elaborate on what some of those mean. But in addition to the dominance, not a lot of Black Americans in gymnastics these days, or any days for that matter. So again, sort of the combination of the groundbreaking and the groundbreaking and the winning, I definitely would include her on there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that starting in 2012, I believe she was on that team even in 2012 that was, won the gold medal.
I don't believe so. I'm not seeing any medals for her in 12.
Okay. Because, I know they won in 12 with, it was Michaela Maroney and Allie Raceman and a few others, but maybe she wasn't on that team.
And I think maybe this gets to my point. If we're putting together this list, I don't know that I could necessarily justify 2 separate women's Olympic gymnastic moments.
Fair
so
enough.
I would probably put Simone Biles.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
For those reasons. And then the only other thing that I had from an Olympic point of view, and this is one that's not American, but I think the pure dominance of it is Usain Bolt.
Yes, no question.
What do they call that? The fastest man in the world?
If you win the 100, I think, right?
I believe that's what it is. And he won in 2012. He won golds in the 100, the 200, and the 4x100. He did not, and he also won. He's won the 100 3 years in a row. I don't know. I don't think he's done, isn't he? Isn't he retired? Yeah, he's retired.
And the thing, as I remember reading about in 2012, the U.S. Olympians, the basketball team, the 100 meter in track is the event. Everybody on that 2012 U.S. basketball team was at that event. It's the race, like they say, for the fastest man in the world. And Bolt, a friend of mine had gotten married a couple weeks before that and was on his honeymoon in Jamaica during the 2012 Summer Olympics. And he said that he had been, they were out at wherever they were in the resort. When Bolt was about to race, all the staff who, normally they're very trained to be always sort of on attention for the customer or
blend into the background
and for the guests' needs. And if you like kind of motion over, but it's like they said, like as soon as Bolt was about to race, they all just went to the bar to watch the thing. Like, and it was just kind of, and nobody got mad at them. It was just like, hey, they didn't. If you had said like, hey, I need something, they'd have been like 5 minutes, because he was the biggest star in the world during the 2012 Summer Olympics.
Well, it's also an event that takes about 23 seconds to watch from preparation to end to celebration. So, so he won the 100 and 200 in 8, 12, and 16, and he was also on the gold medal winning relay team in the 4x100 in both 12 and 16, and now he's retired. Never won a silver or a bronze. It was all golds for him. 8 for 8 in the gold. So, again, we certainly sort of lean against non-American moments. There's a higher bar to hit there, but I think no question that level of dominance in the premier track event in the world definitely merits inclusion.
Yeah, no, it overcomes whatever our sort of slants are.
I did not have anything else. Did you?
Not that I can think of at the moment. We covered the big North American sports. We covered the Olympics and tennis and golf and tried to do our best with everything. I mean, again, I'm sure if you know a lot about rugby or cricket.
But none of those ever make it into the national or international.
Not our national consciousness. That's all I'm saying. And I'm sure maybe if you're a big hockey fan, you can point to something we maybe missed. And again, we're open to that. We're acknowledging that we're doing this within the confines of our own experiences. But I think from our point of view, we covered as much as we. I think it was pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, and there's tiers. It's first.
There is tiers when we talk about the 04 Red Sox or there are definitely tiers there. I agree with you.
So no, but there are tiers of obviously a big NBA moment or a big baseball moment is going to be bigger than some Olympic sport that's more obscure or something in the World Cup, especially if it doesn't involve the U.S. But overall, I think we got a pretty good list there. This was cool. This was fun. This was a little different than the type of thing we usually do, but I thought it would be a nice change of pace.
Yeah, no, it was great, and it's important to kind of realize that even as like a sports history person, it's like there's plenty of sports history going on right now, and then that's obviously a lot of the focus on this podcast is about older things and things that people either. I was born in 1986. Most of what we talk about is before I was born, or certainly before I was consciously aware of what was going on. There's plenty that's gone on this century, this decade, et cetera, that is worthy of. I mean, there's a bunch of topics we just touched on where I'm like, oh, we could do a full episode on that. I'm not saying we will, but it's just kind of helpful sometimes to realize, like, oh no, a lot of the things that have happened now are just as interesting as things that happened 100 or 70 or 50 years ago.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. We will most likely journey back to previous centuries in the next.
We will have the greatest sports moments of the 19th century on our next episode.
Or the 18th.
Guys shooting at pheasants or whatever.
All right. Well, until next time and until the next great moment we choose to cover, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.